happy Sunday, everybody. It's Sunday, the 20th of December, and guys, what I've done, I've put together a documentary, parts of a documentary about the first, our last pandemic. Sorry, not the first, our last pandemic, the 1918 to 1920 pandemic, which is called the Spanish flu. I've put together an insight into what life was like, okay? With real-time filming, real-time newspaper editions and narratives about it, experts talking about it, including Dr. Fauci. Now, guys, the reason I've put this together is because many of us are living, you see, when this pandemic first hit, myself and my 10-year-old went and looked into that 1918 pandemic. Even though I knew a lot about it, I didn't really know enough about it. So we looked into this back in March and April. And many people haven't done that. Because I think if people did that, you see exactly the same behaviors, right? You see nearly the same mistakes that leaders made at the time. You see even a doctor because they didn't know what it was, and we didn't have any medicines at the time. We didn't even have antibiotics. We hadn't even identified influenza, like the flu proper, until 1930s. So like 10 plus years later, in the 30s, was when flu was properly identified. So we didn't have any of this. You'll see doctors who were trying to treat people with hydrogen peroxide. You'll see social distancing, just like they're trying to do now. You'll see mask mandates, just like they're trying to do now. You'll see schools shut down, just like we're doing now. But you'll see many more deaths, right? You'll see people obeying the rules like they did in this time. And then you see people getting fed up of the rules and start disobeying the rules, just like we're doing now. You see, however, the effects of the cities that behaved and the cities that got stubborn. You see exactly what's happening today, guys. You'll also see the effects of basically bad behavior. But there are two things, guys, that aren't on this video that didn't exist then. One was medication and vaccines. So we didn't even know what vaccine was them times. No one had the word for vaccine. No one knew what it was. It never been discussed as a tool, as a medical tool. Just like antibiotics had never been discussed at that time. So you won't see medicines, and you won't see antibiotics, and you won't see anything to do with vaccines. That's the first thing. The second thing you won't see, guys, is fake news. You won't see fake news. You won't see anyone calling it, it's going to disappear in the summer. Oh, it's a fake thing. Oh, this is a plan brought on by the other side of the political aisle. Oh, this is invented by someone in a lab. Because they couldn't say any of that, because we didn't invent anything like that at the time. But guess what? We still had a pandemic, and you still see exactly the same behaviors. So guys, my advice to anyone who sees this first part, my narrative of it, because I'm not going to be talking through it. This is the last you're going to hear from me, and the rest of it is going to be the documentary. So I hope you enjoyed the documentary. But more importantly, I hope that you guys share this video, because I think a huge amount of us need to understand that this is not the first time this has happened. And this is not the first time human beings have behaved like this. What you got that time was governments on an agenda, like the right-wing government on an agenda, kept things quiet. But they didn't give fake news. There was nothing such as fake news at the time. People died. In those days, you had to wait 2-3 days with a dead body in your house. Could be your daughter, could be your mother, could be your dad, with the dead body in the house until they came with a horse and a cart to take the body away from you. The body could be smelling at this point. That's how bad it was. Guys, this is educational. Please share, please subscribe, and I'll see you all on Monday for my next edition. Take care. Bye-bye.
Philadelphia was probably the hardest hit. They knew it was coming. They should have seen it coming. They shouldn't have allowed this parade. They did because, again, priorities. What were the priorities? The war effort and selling these war bonds.
When I was reading about the parade in Philadelphia, this huge Liberty Loan parade that was going to be in 1918. And I was thinking to myself, don't do the parade, don't do the parade. And then the week later, I think it's thousands of people die, perhaps 14,000 people. And then you go to St. Louis, another city, also had prepared a parade. They listened to the medical authorities, and the next week only 700 people died. So when you're reading this as an historian and you know the end of the story, you want to say, stop, do the right thing.
The day after the parade, the Philadelphia Inquirer printed this picture. The caption, "Fighting men of Navy thrill vast crowds as they march along Broad Street." No mention of the influenza. Less than a week later, the Board of Health finally begins shutting down the city.
In the streets of Philadelphia, people were actually dropping dead in the streets.
There were stories, rather well documented stories, Anderson, of people who would wake up in the morning feeling maybe a little bit under the weather, get up and go to work, starting to feel really very, very sick. And by the time the end of the day came, they were dying in bed and would die literally within a 24-hour period.
It was that fast.
Oh, absolutely.
The situation was so dire, it couldn't be ignored any longer. This issue of the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin, dated October 15, 1918, reports entire families dying from the flu. It reads, "Husbands and wives, mothers and children, brothers and sisters have died within a few hours of one another."
They were using steam shovels to dig mass graves at one point. You had priests literally driving horse-drawn carts down the street, calling upon people to bring out their dead. It sometimes would be a couple of days before a body could be disposed of, and you had to live with the body in your home. And the fear really emptied the streets.
There were empty streets in cities across the country. All were experiencing the same fear and panic as Philadelphia. In the month of October, more than 195,000 Americans died from the virus, many of them in excruciating pain.
It was a terrible way to die. You can picture these young men and eventually young women and nurses, family members, literally choking to death on their own body fluids, turning blue and dying. One of the doctors in one of the hospitals in New York said, they're coming in by the hundreds, they're turning blue and they're dying. One doctor says, I see them twice, once when they check in and once when I sign their death certificate.
This is rare footage of an influenza patient being brought in for treatment. But there was little doctors could do. There was no way to treat the influenza. Doctors and nurses just had to watch their patients die. This letter was written by a volunteer nurse in Washington, D.C. When I was in the officers' barracks, she wrote, 4 of the officers of whom I had charge died. 2 of them were married and called for their wife nearly all the time. It was sure pitiful to see them die. I had to go to the nurses' quarters and cry it out. They couldn't treat the dying in 1918 because they didn't know what they were fighting. They didn't even know what an influenza virus was.
The doctors at the time, scientists, did not know what the pathogen was because the virus itself, influenza, was not discovered until more than a decade and a half, 2 decades later in the 1930s. So what was likely going on, and again, we didn't recognize it because we did not have antibiotics, is that it was not only the primary virus itself, unrecognized at the time, which turned out to be influenza A, that it was causing devastating viral pneumonias, but superimposed upon it now, when you went back and did autopsy examinations retrospectively, you found that very many of the people died from secondary bacterial infections. In other words, they had a primary viral pneumonia, and superimposed upon that was a bacterial pneumonia that could have been, had we had antibiotics at the time, which we did not, that could have been treated with common antibiotics.
So how do you treat a virus you don't understand? This Fox Movietone newsreel from the pandemic era shows 2 men walking to greet each other, not with a handshake, but with a salute in order to avoid touching hands, though they do walk away arm in arm. It was an effort to educate the public on safe behavior during an outbreak. But these recommended measures couldn't stop the spread of the virus because not everyone would listen.
The virus was spread clearly by the respiratory route. I think just even rudimentary epidemiology would tell you that the close contact with people, there was congregate settings, people crowding together either indoors or in many respects, sometimes even outdoors. It was very clear that this was person-to-person spread.
Pretty much everything was tried, even to the extent that one report in the Journal of the American Medical Association of a doctor who injected hydrogen peroxide intravenously, thinking that the oxygen would help the patient. And roughly half of his patients died. He actually claimed that that was successful. So people were quite desperate and trying absolutely everything.
There was no federal plan and no real strong federal public health service in the U.S. at the time. So local states and cities took it upon themselves to fight a pandemic they didn't really understand. New York made it a misdemeanor to cough or sneeze without covering your mouth or nose in public. In Philadelphia, spitters were fined $2.30 for jeopardizing health. Open-air courts in San Francisco dealt with people who didn't wear masks in public. They were fined and in some cases thrown in jail. Back then, masks were not quite as controversial as they are now, but they also may not have been as effective. These nurses are making masks out of gauze, which they fold over 4 times. But gauze is porous, even with the layers, and in some cases didn't protect people from getting the virus. The Journal of the American Medical Association in September of 1918 said the virus was infecting doctors and nurses in hospitals in spite of the use of gauze masks and other precautions by all those in contact with the patients. Watch this one group of nurses as they demonstrate how to wear the masks. First, they wrap them around their mouths, but then fold them down to expose their noses. A virus can infect through the nasal cavity. But still, a properly worn mask back then was better than no mask at all.
We know now from meta-analysis that masks are effective. They're not 100% effective. They likely are more effective in preventing a person who's infected from transmitting it versus someone protecting themselves from getting infected. Even though recent data indicate that there is some degree of protection both ways, the fact that back then individuals who were wearing masks, and even now with COVID-19, some people who wear masks can get infected. That doesn't mean that masks are not helpful.
Despite these attempts at public health and safety, people kept dying. Cities around the country who were hit later with the virus were learning the lessons of Boston and Philadelphia.
It's also interesting because when you look at President Wilson, there was a war going on, so there wasn't a lot of talk by Wilson about the pandemic.
No, there was not. And that was the point. It was left up in many respects to the individual states, cities, and locations. And there wasn't that uniform type of coordination and communication about what worked or did not work in one city versus the other. They essentially were left on their own to do what it was that they wanted to do. And there were some stark failures and there were some really notable successes.
There were other cities which didn't even print the names of the dead. They were trying to pretend that this thing wasn't happening. And that wasn't reassuring people because they knew it was happening. It increased the level of fear, increased alienation. There were very few places where they did tell the truth. One was San Francisco. In San Francisco, the mayor, the public health leaders, the leaders of the business community, leaders of trade unions, all jointly signed a statement. And this was printed in huge type in the newspaper. It said, "Wear a mask and save your life." And that it was a very, very different message than this is ordinary influenza by another name.
San Francisco shut the city down. They banned mass gatherings, closed schools and movie theaters. And it worked, at least in the beginning.
They have great success initially in the fall of 1918. They relaxed too soon.
In November, they got rid of the mask mandate and reopened businesses.
San Francisco went like this, down and then up. And then when it started to go up, they tried to put the mask law back into effect, but the people weren't having it the second time around. The same arguments we're hearing today about wearing masks. Infringement on freedom, infringement on liberty. So all of the arguments that we've heard today about non-mask wearing, they argued in San Francisco, and it was bad.
1919, the mood in Paris is joyful. World leaders, including President Woodrow Wilson, are meeting in France to negotiate a peace treaty. The war is finally over. But the pandemic is not. It's now in its third wave and spreading in France. This warning, printed in the journal The American Medical Association, states the epidemic of influenza, which had declined, has broken out anew in a most disquieting manner. But that was overshadowed, this time by the fierce negotiations between the heads of the United States, Great Britain, France, and Italy. Known as the Big Four, they were trying to negotiate how to settle peace terms with Germany.
When the war ended and the peace talks were approaching, what was Wilson's stance on the Germans going into these talks? Because he famously talked about peace without victory.
Woodrow Wilson talked continually about peace without victory. He wanted no real retribution against Germany, no humiliation against Germany. He just thought that that would just set off, perhaps, as somebody said, a century of war. So he went into those peace talks hoping that he could persuade the European nations of moving in that direction. It would have been a hard job to do so because the war had been fought on European soil. Millions of Europeans had been hurt by it, and that desire for exacting retribution was already there. So he was already coming up against a difficulty when he came there, but he was hoping that he would get it through.
On April 3rd, as the peace talks continued, President Wilson collapsed. He was so severely ill so suddenly that his doctor suspected he may have been poisoned. But it turns out it was likely the influenza, and it may have affected him both mentally and physically. This is a private letter from Wilson's doctor in Paris dated April 14th, 1919. He wrote, "The president was suddenly taken violently sick with the influenza at a time when the whole of civilization seemed to be in the balance."
And as he started to recover, everybody around him, from Irwin Hoover, who was the White House usher, to Herbert Hoover, the later president, commented that his mind simply didn't work. He couldn't remember things that had happened a few hours earlier. He got paranoid, thought there were French spies behind the furniture. Some very, very strange things.
Doctors and historians now believe the influenza may have had a profound effect on patients' brains.
Just like COVID-19, the 1918 virus had very significant neurological manifestations. The result was a peace treaty that again violated the principles that he said the U.S. had gone to war over. It was a long way from a peace without victory. Germany was blamed for the war.
Anger in Germany.
History is something that is a cycle of events. So the fact that the Treaty of Versailles had such draconian provisions, the fact that it demanded so many economic sanctions and humiliation really for Germany, they argue, historians do, that it contributed to the rise of nationalism and the rise of Adolf Hitler. If you go back and you look at Wilson and argue that maybe his having the flu affected his behavior in the negotiation of the Treaty of Versailles, then it unrolls even more. But
the great influenza of 1918 lingered on until 1920, before finally going away. By the end, an estimated 1/3 of the world's population had been infected by the virus, and the death toll in America and across the globe was stunning.
675,000 Americans in the space of a year. That's more than all of the men who have died in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam put together. The numbers around the world are even more astonishing.
Within the realm of recorded history, there were anywhere from 50 to 100 million people died. And in a population of the world that was at that time in 1918, about 1/3 of what the population of the world is today, you could just imagine and do the math of, in today's time, what that would have meant. That would have meant anywhere from 150 to 300 million people dying from this.
So even the worst case projections for COVID-19 are absolutely nothing like what occurred in 1918, fortunately.
The death toll in this current pandemic may never reach the levels of the influenza of 1918, partly because in this outbreak, there is the promise of a vaccine.
That's going to be the game changer, and that's going to be the difference that separates us from the 1918 ultimate impact to the ultimate impact of what we're seeing now.